I'm Allison Nagel. I'm co-executive director here at Sustainable Solano. I want to thank you all for joining us tonight for this informational discussion of the California Environmental Quality Act, or CEQA, its history and the implications of recent changes to it. Sustainable Solano works within our Solano communities on environmental justice and climate issues, so it's important for us to know about policy changes that can affect our local communities. And we're grateful to have two speakers here with us tonight. We have Dr. Bonnie Hamilton, who's a Sustainable Solano board member and a Solano pediatrician and member of Climate Health Now and Physicians for Social Responsibility, and Gabriel Tolson, who's an environmental policy associate with the Planning and Conservation League. So there will be time at the end for questions. If you do have questions as we're going through, feel free to drop them in the chat or hold on to them until the end. If you have any technical issues, feel free to reach out to me directly. But with that, Bonnie and Gabriel, thank you both for being here, and I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much, and glad to see everyone here. We may have a small meeting, but that's okay. I think everyone's voice is important in this matter. I'm really concerned about what happened in June, and Gabriel will go more into this, where there was a bill that was passed through the legislature and by the governor that allowed an exemption for something called advanced manufacturing, which really creates a toxic pollution loophole in the California Environmental Quality Act, which is known as CEQA, that has protected California's air, water, and land for many, many years at this point, and has kept California environmentally sound. But this change in the law really creates a new issue that we haven't dealt with in a long time. There's a fine balance between allowing certain a progressive development to go through that certainly that would help the climate and our environment. However, at the same time, we can't do things at the risk of communities, health of people, and our environment. And there are no disposable people, and there are no disposable communities. So everyone has that right to clean air and water and land, and may not have the same resources to be able to move where they want to move away from toxic pollution. So I'm going to turn it over to Gabriel, who is absolutely I feel like he's an expert on this issue, and I really appreciate him joining us this evening. Gabriel, it's all yours. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Bonnie, Allison, and everyone for joining tonight. I'll share my screen, which has a few slides. Everyone seeing my screen all right? Okay. All right. Well, thanks again for making time this evening to learn about this urgent issue. I'm Gabriel Tolson. I'm here with the Planning and Conservation League. We are a Sacramento-based advocacy organization focused on sustainable land use and environmental conservation. As Bonnie just discussed, today's briefing focuses on an urgent issue moving through the state legislature at the moment, which has real and serious implications for public health and our natural resources. That matter is a cleanup of Senate Bill 131, a bill enacted last year that allows nearly all industrial facilities to bypass requirements for public disclosure, impact analysis, and pollution reduction under the California Environmental Quality Act. I know that many of you are quite familiar with this issue, so I'll do my best to move through this briefing pretty efficiently and allow plenty of time for a strategy discussion afterwards. As others have mentioned, feel free to leave any questions in the chat for me to address at the end. So diving right in, this bill exempted projects from the review that occurs specifically under the California Environmental Quality Act. So we'll spend just a moment reviewing exactly how that law works. It has three main features. Firstly, the law ensures that agencies must analyze and disclose the environmental and public health impacts of a proposed project. Second, agencies must identify feasible ways to avoid or reduce those significant impacts. This mitigation requirement really is the heart of CEQA, and it's relatively unique to this law in comparison to parallels that exist in other states and at the federal level. It's how the law really improves projects. Third, CEQA provides for community participation. It is the only state law that guarantees public input on land use decisions, and it's now a critical legal tool used by community organizations to protect vulnerable and pollution-burdened neighborhoods. Indeed, CEQA is the only tool available to analyze and mitigate what are called cumulative pollution impacts, defined as the combined pollution of multiple industrial facilities located close to one another. So, in other words, where an air permit or a water quality permit will regulate facilities in isolation from one another. Only CEQA review allows for the analysis of the combined pollution of multiple facilities located near one another. Critically, CEQA review, this process does not itself provide for the approval or the denial of projects, despite what its opponents might claim. Rather, it simply grants communities the right to know and to comment about projects proposed in their areas, and it allows public agencies the opportunity to improve projects by reducing their pollution. So with that background in mind, I'll turn now to SB 131. This bill was enacted on June 30th of last year as what's known as a quote budget trailer bill. This means that it bypassed the standard legislative process, and it was not subject to the typical schedule of amendments, committee analyses, and public hearings. Instead, this language was published only on Friday, June 27th, just 3 days before it was signed into law the next Monday. Rather unprecedented and certainly, I would say, unethical for a bill of this scale. And during the bill's only committee hearing, as well as on the Senate floor later that evening on the day that it passed, many legislators recognized the public outcry over this bill and made commitments to fix its worst elements. And so most alarming of these CEQA exemptions, most alarming of these elements was a CEQA exemption for, as Bonnie mentioned, a vague category of industrial projects known as, quote, advanced manufacturing. And if we look at the definition of advanced manufacturing provided in this law, we see that it's quite broad. State law defines this category as, quote, systems that result from substantive advancement, whether incremental or breakthrough, beyond current industry standards in the production of materials and products. This definition also includes any manufacturing facility that uses a computer in some capacity, which is practically every industrial facility, or that achieves certain economic efficiencies, including by replacing workers with AI. So why is it so broad? It's because it wasn't actually drafted for a CEQA exemption. Rather, it was drafted in 2012 for an unrelated state tax credit program. So it was meant to be vague enough to allow for the introduction and funding of technologies that at that time did not yet exist. And through this tax credit program, this same definition has already been applied to include projects engaged in chemical recycling, metal forging, biofuel refining, even a strip mine in the Mojave Desert, and nuclear fusion testing, among more than 70 other industrial sectors. In fact, if we look at the language of this exemption, one developer has already tried to use that language to classify a data center as advanced manufacturing. Of course, these types of industrial processes can involve hazardous materials like PFAS, lead, heavy metal fumes, carcinogenic and lethal chemicals, substances linked to birth defects, and even radioactive material. Additionally, these facilities can use significant amounts of water and energy, up to 10 million gallons per day of fresh water, for example, in the case of semiconductor manufacturing. And before we move on, just to digest this bill a little bit more, I want to focus on a few misconceptions we often hear about Senate Bill 131 as well as CEQA broadly. And the first of those is that this bill was a housing bill. It's something we hear a lot, where in reality, it was passed in conjunction with the housing bill, but it doesn't actually affect, for the most part, housing. Rather, its corollary in the Assembly, AB 130, included the largest housing-related CEQA exemption passed in state history. It essentially exempted from CEQA most urban housing projects on parcels 20 acres or less, but that's a separate bill. Another myth that I'd like to address is this idea that the impacts from these advanced manufacturing facilities will be confined to industrial zones. Most people who've lived near or passed through areas containing industrial zones will know that zoning itself is pretty insufficient to protect residents from pollution hazards. To begin with, air pollution and other impacts of industrial projects, of course, travel across the boundaries of industrial zones. This is especially problematic because these zones are over-concentrated in disadvantaged communities statewide, as a legislature has recognized repeatedly through air pollution control measures. The final myth I'd like to cover is the idea that other laws outside of CEQA are sufficient to protect the public from industrial hazards. In fact, CEQA is the only state law that requires a comprehensive assessment of all of the environmental and the public health impacts associated with proposed projects. And this includes, of course, as I discussed before, the cumulative impacts of a project, which is crucial for protecting overburdened communities from further pollution. And so by requiring this upfront holistic evaluation of all potentially significant negative impacts, CEQA can actually lead to alternative project designs, the selection of alternative sites, and stronger mitigation measures than would otherwise be required under more narrow and issue-specific regulations. In addition, other state laws do not ensure the same level of public participation and transparency as CEQA. For example, most other permitting processes, while they might involve public participation, they often don't require agencies to solicit public comments on environmental documents and seriously respond to those comments. And that's where CEQA really has a value add. And to emphasize the imminent danger posed by this exemption, we prepared maps illustrating the proximity of industrial zones to homes and communities across Solano County. So you're seeing here on the screen a screenshot illustrating on the left industrial zoning in Fairfield, and on the right just how close those industrial zones are to what we call sensitive receptors. And that's a category that includes homes, schools, daycare centers. You're seeing here that this factory for the Clorox company, which should read to most people as an obviously hazardous land use, is located less than 1,000 feet from the nearest home, and what looks to be less than 2,000 feet from one school, less than 3,000 feet from another school. Highlighted in yellow with these, highlighted with these yellow diamonds are what are called toxic release inventory sites. These are sites known to be associated with chronic and often excessive levels of pollutants, including toxic pollutants. Another example exists in Vallejo. You'll see that in one case, a toxic release inventory site is less than 1,500 feet from the nearest home, and the industrial zone itself, inside of which now exempt facilities may be sited, directly border these residential areas. The last example I'll touch on is in Vacaville, and you'll see again, this industrial zone is right next to residential areas. This toxic release inventory site is less than 1,000 feet from the nearest home, and what looks to be less than 2,000 feet from this from a community park. So in addition to posing these risks, in the regions where many of you live, SB 131 may also accelerate components of the California Forever project. Most of you know all about this project. Of course, it's a billionaire-backed proposal to create a new city in rural Solano County, large enough to accommodate a population roughly equivalent to that of Oakland. Now, critically, just 2 weeks after Senate Bill 131 passed, California Forever announced plans for, quote, an advanced manufacturing industrial park, which they call the Foundry, that would border its proposed new city. The park would, quote, pre-entitle 2,100 acres of land currently used as farmland. They would pre-entitle that area for industrial development broadly, and they would issue what they're calling over-the-counter permits in 90 days or less, even for heavy industrial uses. As many of you are well aware, county leaders have previously directed California Forever to undergo the full CEQA process to address the significant adverse impacts posed by a new city on local water supplies, on energy grids, on traffic and natural ecosystems, critically including the sensitive Montezuma wetlands and the Bay Delta watershed. And by waiving CEQA for advanced manufacturing, SB 131 may weaken local planning authority to control for the impacts of this potential project, and could empower California Forever to build a new greenfield manufacturing town with little to no project-specific analysis and mitigation of the associated environmental and public health impacts. No mitigation of industrial pollution, and none of the public review or hearings that are normally required under CEQA. And beyond California Forever, multiple in-district examples also point to the potential long-term costs of this exemption. For instance, Wicks Forest Industries, a former wood processing plant in Vacaville, contaminated the city's groundwater with hexavalent chromium, a substance 500 times more carcinogenic than diesel exhaust. This substance was the subject of what's that movie? Aaron Brockovich. It's widely known as a highly damaging and harmful pollutant. More than 30 years later, Vacaville's drinking water still contains more than twice the safety threshold for hexavalent chromium. And that is a long-term result of a former industrial use. Now, further south in Vallejo, cleanup of lead and other toxins from a former industrial site has cost the state more than has cost broadly. I think part of that was covered by private entities, but it has cost more than $290 million to clean up and remains unfinished after 25 years. Now, critically, DTSC, or the Department of Toxic Substances Control, it received only $36 million last year to clean up all, quote, orphan sites, as we call them, statewide. Clearly, it's a number that's insufficient to cover the cleanup associated with even one of these sites, let alone all sites across the state. And the point here is that CEQA has been critical in filling this funding gap by, first of all, providing that projects pay for comprehensive post-closure remediation in some cases, and but more often just preventing the pollution impacts in the first place that would need to be cleaned up in the future. And that burden, if not covered upfront, is most often shifted to the public. A final provision of SB 131 that I'll cover is the fact that this bill rolled back protections for sensitive and endangered species habitat across more than a dozen new CEQA exemptions. This was a very large budget bill. It included more than 12 CEQA exemptions. And for all of those exemptions, it rolled back what had been, up to that point, standard exclusions for habitat for sensitive or threatened species. Of course, this is a major reversal of state policy. It's not even seen, or excuse me, it goes even farther than that AB 130 housing exemption bill that I mentioned earlier, as well as other major exemptions that have been passed by the same Senator Wiener, who authored SB 131. And it has grave and widespread implications for our state's sensitive and endangered species. And that's especially true because it's often through the initial study process of CEQA that the presence of an endangered species on a site is even identified in the first place. And that identification is often necessary to trigger, for example, the permitting process under the California Endangered Species Act. And if a project is removed entirely from the CEQA review process, that initial study doesn't ever occur. And so projects could bulldoze through sensitive habitat without any form of accountability or recourse. So turning now to the part of the briefing that I'm sure many of you have been waiting for, where the legislature stands in terms of the cleanup of this hazardous bill, and what you can do during this critical time. So as I mentioned, after 131 passed last year, 35 members of the Senate and the Assembly signed a letter expressing their commitment to either remove or significantly narrow this dangerous advanced manufacturing CEQA exemption. This year, after many discussions with labor, environmental, and environmental justice stakeholders, Senator Blake Spears introduced a cleanup proposal in the form of Senate Bill 954 and is currently gathering support amongst legislators. And I should mention that last week, that bill made it out of its first committee, and just this morning, it made it out of its second committee. It's now headed toward, I know it's big news, it's now headed to appropriations, then to the floor, and then if it passes both those stages, it will have to be reviewed by the Assembly. It's a relatively complicated bill, so I'd like to spend just a moment discussing how this bill works. There are three tiers. First of all, it addresses this overly broad advanced manufacturing definition. It still leaves actual blanks in the language of the bill for reasons that I can discuss during the Q&A. It's a little bit involved, but critically, this bill does signal the intent of the legislature to limit the applicability of this exemption to a narrow and clearly defined set of projects. Additionally, the bill establishes that the exemption may apply only to what are called final tier manufacturing facilities. Or for example, this is a tier that applies to not the manufacture of subassembly components, but rather market-ready final product. So if we think about, for example, the supply chain necessary to produce silicone anode batteries, this would exclude the development of silicone anode powder, or the battery cells themselves, and would include only the facilities that assemble those preformed battery components. And we restricted it to that final tier because typically those facilities have they tend to have lesser impact on public health and on the environment. Second of all, this bill establishes necessary guardrails. So it establishes that this exemption may only be used by projects that are located outside of endangered or threatened species habitat and a safe distance from homes, schools, and other sensitive receptors. Other critical guardrails included in the bill are requirements that exempt projects must comply with certain air emission thresholds, that they enter into a community benefits agreement, that they protect tribal cultural resources, and that they incorporate enforceable labor protections. Now, finally, the bill addressed a problem which is common across CEQA exemptions, which is that there's no statewide agency typically that regulates the use and application or that verifies the use and application of CEQA exemptions. That's because those are handled individually by the 500 odd jurisdictions across the state. So 954 would try to control for that by creating a statewide certification program. That would establish state oversight over the uses of this exemption by providing that the governor's office or another entity yet to be established certify the projects both in terms of their qualifying for the definition of advanced manufacturing, their suitable siting, but also that they meet certain higher industrial emission standards that would be established under that certification program. And that flexibility is there to allow this program to respond to the specific risks posed by those facilities ultimately included in the exemption. So, for example, this definition may end up including staging areas for offshore wind. That comes with very particular impacts that might be associated with dredging. If these facilities are sited in ports, often dredging is required to create a staging area large enough to build the turbines themselves. And so this certification program is drafted in a way that's flexible enough to allow this government agency to develop specific environmental criteria by which they can evaluate these projects and determine whether they should be exempt or whether they should go through a more robust review process. So that's 954 from a high level. And the last thing I'll mention is just that we urge members of Solano County or residents of Solano County to contact Senator Cabaldon and Assemblymember Wilson and encourage them to support these necessary cleanup efforts. And on this slide, I've included URLs to the contact forms for those two members. That's all I have. Allison and Bonnie, back to you.